hands together and welcome Edna Longley.
Thank you, Ryan. Can I just check that you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
back.
Yes.
All right. The title of my talk, slightly different from what's advertised, is The Notes That Did So Haunt Me, Birdsong, Song and Poetry. In his fascinating talk last night, Sean Street distinguished between hearing and listening. There's a parallel with Edward Thomas's own distinction between looking and seeing. His poem, First Known and Lost, contains the line, "And now I see as I look." I was also very struck by what Sean said about sound and silence. In Thomas's poem March, a great chorus of birdsong is followed by a silence stained with all that hour's songs. That's a bold visual image for some enduring sonic vibration, perhaps of poetry too. In effect, Sean showed us how Thomas's prose listens to the natural world. Poetry is an art that depends on the ear. Thomas and Robert Frost agreed about this. Frost called the ear the only true writer and the only true reader. And so often, Frost was saying that poets must attend to sounds of human speech. But perhaps natural sounds also formed Thomas's ear. Perhaps they contributed to the acoustic of his poetry as it emerged from his prose. While it's impossible to prove that notion, several poems refer to natural sounds as their immediate inspiration. A roar of parleying starlings, wind moaning around a new house, aspens at the crossroads talking together. The mill water begins, only the sound remains of the old mill, and the poem's own sound effects mimic water falling, changelessly calling. The source dramatizes the voices of wind and rain and flood, and connects those voices with the source of poetry itself. But for Thomas, it's primarily birds that vocalize the non-human world as a poetic source. His poem, The Unknown Bird, associates his muse with a mysterious bird. 3 lovely notes he whistled, too soft to be heard. If others sang, but others never sang, in the great beechwood all that May and June. The bird was never seen, only heard, and never heard by anyone else. Oftenest when I heard him, I was alone, nor could I ever make another hear. Also deaf are a set of people who might have been expected to know birds. I told the naturalists, but neither had they heard anything like the notes that did so haunt me. Here I think the unknown bird more openly becomes a poem about poetry. To say that naturalists have never heard those notes is to distinguish the artist from the wildlife expert. For Thomas, the only contemporary who united the qualities of both was W.H. Hudson, whom he sought to emulate in his own prose. But the unknown bird implies that his poetry has left behind or subsumed the naturalist of his prose. And indeed the word naturalists may have a further meaning. It may define Thomas's aesthetic as symbolist rather than naturalistic. The notes that did so haunt me elude all material explanation. They are called bodiless. The unknown bird suggests how deeply Thomas's sense of poetic vocation and the full meaning of that word is bound up with birdsong. A bird calls him to poetry, or signifies the call to poetry. Again, the difficulty of locating or identifying the bird represents poetry as a mystery, a spirit. I think Sean used the word spirit last night. Indeed, the bodiless bird might symbolize symbolism itself. The poem ends with the speaker too becoming bodiless, light as that bird wandering beyond my shore. Beyond my shore. This is the poet as visionary wanderer. Later, I'll be considering 3 more Ars Poetica poems that link birdsong and poetry. These poems feature the song of a known bird, the thrush. Now, as you know, symbolic birds have permeated the poetry and art of many cultures. In Homer, birds are auguries, battlefield omens, bearers of messages from Olympus. In Ovid, human beings and human behaviour morph into birds. Birds seem an inexhaustible symbolic resource, and all the poets reading today, I think, prove that. A resource that includes symbols for poets themselves. Identification between bird and poet, bird song and poetry, reached its English language apotheosis in the Romantic period. The unknown bird, like so much of Thomas's work, testifies to his romantic roots. In The Defence of Poetry, Shelley calls the poet a nightingale who sits in darkness and sings to cheer his own solitude with sweet sounds. A nightingale who sits in darkness and sings to cheer his own solitude with sweet sounds. Very like that hidden bird in the beechwood. In his poem, After You Speak, Thomas concentrates Shelley's lark poet into a mote of singing dust, a mote of singing dust. He also liked to quote Wordsworth's To the Skylark, true to the kindred points of heaven and home. For Thomas, those kindred points seem to represent both an existential and an aesthetic principle. But I want to argue that the pervasive presence of birds and birdsong in Thomas's poetry doesn't simply repeat or renew familiar tropes. Rather, it consorts with his status as perhaps a truly ecocentric rather than anthropocentric poet, the poet who called himself an inhabitant of earth. Indeed, science has validated a poet's sense of affinity with birds as cohabitants of earth. The notes that did so haunt me. The word notes implies that Thomas sees birdsong as an art akin to human music making. That kinship, now proved, has been exploited by modern composers like Messiaen, not to mention earlier Beethoven and the Yellowhammer. Science has also found an evolutionary convergence between birdsong and humanity's acquisition of language, both in the species and the individual. To quote one scientific summary, there are behavioural, neural, and genetic parallels as regards auditory vocal learning. I repeat that. Behavioural, neural, and genetic parallels as regards auditory vocal learning between birds and us. Thomas, I think, anticipated such findings by making bird song so integral to his aesthetic with its ecocentric bearings. Birdsong is surely more than a metaphor for Thomas's poetry. It's also a context and touchstone. Over half of Edward Thomas's poems mention birds. You should just count yourselves. He sometimes just lists birds in lines that relish their names, a relish that underscores their earthly and poetic presence. Hawk, heron, owl, and woodpecker, linnets, greenfinches, and goldfinches, peewit, woodpecker, swan, and rook, the swift swallow, the hawk, and the heron. Like his prose, Thomas's poetry refers to many aspects of bird life: their appearance, their movements in flight, in flocks or in perches, the marks they leave on landscape, their habits and habitats, their seasonal arrivals and departures. But birds mainly figure as the sounds they make. I'm now going to read a collage of lines from Thomas's poems in which the words sing, sang, and song refer to birds. They had but an hour to sing. On boughs they sang while they changed perches. A robin sang, a shade in shade. Mellow the blackbird sang, and sharp the thrush. When the thrush-cock sings, bright, irrelevant things. The nettle creeper and garden warbler sang unceasingly, a song, a blackbird song at dawn. He planted elms where now the stormcock sings. And most famously, the last 4 lines of Adlestrop. And for that minute, a blackbird sang close by, and round him, mistier, farther and farther, all the birds of Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire. The sounds and movement of that quatrain, the lingeringly rhymed mistier and Gloucestershire, support the assertion that birdsong is rippling out into the distance, as the poem itself has done. Similarly, in a passage I quoted from March, repetitions of word, syntax, and sound reinforce the impression of a frantic chorus. On boughs they sang while they changed perches. In Thomas's poetry, word sounds emphasize bird sounds or take inspiration from them. Other examples are the line mellow the blackbird sang and sharp the thrush. That's a musical comment. And the phrase sang unceasingly, in which the adverb echoes and prolongs the verb. I've been quoting from poems by Thomas that appeal to all the senses, and last night Sean talked about birdsong being part of a whole context or landscape in prose. Yet poems are composed of sound, and birdsong may often provide a key signature which sets or confirms a tone for all the rest. That's so at the end of Adlestrop. The song puts a seal on the poem. At the end of Digging, the robin sings over again sad songs of autumn mirth. In Thomas's well-known poem, The Owl, a birdsong key signature comes centre stage, since an owl's cry, a most melancholy cry, links the guilt-ridden speaker with soldiers and poor, unable to rejoice. Not an owl's song there, an owl's cry. Song isn't the only noun, or sing the only verb, that Thomas attaches to the sounds made by birds. They also cry, call, caw, chatter, chuckle, mew, parley, roar, shout, scream, shriek, say, talk, tell, twit, twitter, wail, wheeze, whimper, and whistle. That was an alphabetical first. Most of those verbs also apply to human utterance, and some are so applied in Thomas's poems, or applied to his poems. Does this mean that he's being anthropomorphic, also when attaching adjectives like melancholy or sad to bird sounds? I would suggest that it's perfectly clear when the emotion is subjective. Thus, Thomas disputes Shakespeare's merry version of the owl's cry. I would also suggest that his verbs credit birds with having their own variegated language, given equal status with human speech. Two poems allude to the difficulty of translating bird language. In If I Were to Own, Thomas's poem for his son, the thrush sings well, his proverbs untranslatable. And in She Dotes, a mad girl, obsessed with her dead lover, falls asleep, trying to translate the word the cuckoo cries to his mate over and over. In fact, science has also been catching up with the interpretation of birds' songs and calls, well, these must, of course, remain foreign. Perhaps bird language participates in Thomas's broader dialectics between familiarity and strangeness, alienation and shared earthly belonging. On the one hand, birds are indifferent to human life, as to the mad girl's tragedy. On the other hand, in Thomas's Home, a poem about belonging, the speaker affirms, one nationality we had, I and the birds that sang, one memory. One nationality we had, I and the birds that sang, one memory. A darker version of oneness, or of kinship in sound, occurs in February Afternoon, where men at war resemble birds noisily competing for food. Now, Thomas also evokes the rest of the natural world in terms of language and conflicting sound. I began by quoting the Mill Water, where water calling exemplifies forces or voices that overwhelm human existence and consciousness. Yet that poem also recalls a lost sound, which marks cooperation between humanity and water, the music of the mill wheel's busy roar. In the brook, Thomas virtually makes water, sound and movement an image of poetry, the motion and the voices of the stream. Similar contrast or conflict with references to wind. Thomas has a positive poem, a Shelleyan poem called The Wind's Song. But in the Mountain Chapel, wind is given a bleak voice that excludes humanity and tells us, when gods were young, this wind was old. Wind and water also voice dark interior forces in poems such as Rain. Despite the mill wheel's music, Thomas's most negative sound word is roar, that word roar in his poetry, a word he assigns to ominous mergers of trees, wind and water. And next, aspens. Yet in aspens, I'm sure you all know, tree and wind symbolises poetry in a way which complements the unknown bird. Here, the whisper of the aspens defines poetry as talk rather than song, rather gloomy talk. The poem ends with this identification between poet and tree. Whatever wind blows, while they and I have leaves, we cannot other than an aspen leaf that ceaselessly, unreasonably grieves, or so men think we like a different tree. The noun and adjective, a noun and verb, whisper, crosses between natural and human sounds. It recurs in the next, in Thomas's poem, I Never Saw That Land Before, in the last three stanzas. The speaker conceives a poetics which has absorbed the natural world as an expressive totality. Wind, trees, and birds, they're all there. The breeze that hinted all and nothing spoke. If I could sing, but would not even whisper my soul as I went on my journeying, I should use, as the trees and birds did, a language not to be betrayed. And what was hid should still be hid, excepting from those like me made, who answer when such whispers bid. If I could sing, there implies the speaker isn't yet a poet. In I Never Saw That Land Before, Thomas seems to revisit the origins of his poetry, and those origins include a natural soundscape, birds, wind and trees, as well as an ecocentric ground. If I could sing, it's less common these days to call a poem a song, or to call the poet a singer, let alone a nightingale. 50 years ago, Ted Hughes's crow poems went to the opposite extreme, rather too crocally in my opinion. But some modern poets do use the word song self-referentially, perhaps because it's more flexibly adapted to metre or rhythm than are the words poem and poetry. Actually, Thomas does mention poetry, rhymed with to be, in his poem about himself and Robert Frost, The Sun Used to Shine. It's also the case that English lacks a general verb other than sing for what poets do with their voices. Sing heavenly news, commands Milton. And Thomas, as a reviewer of poetry, quite often prefaces a quotation by saying, some poets sing, Lawrence Binyon sings, for example. You'll be wondering about the last four lines there. That's not by Edward Thomas, as you will have recognised. It's actually by W.B. Yeats, that quatrain. I put it there because Yeats is a modern poet who often alludes to his poems as songs, to his poetry as song. For instance, in these lines, that's from a poem called A Prayer in Old Age. Prayer in Old Age. God guard me from those thoughts men think, in the mind alone. He that sings a lasting song thinks in a marrow bone. And here, Yeats is affirming the folk roots, the folk song roots of poetry. He is also, by the way, attacking what he sees of the abstraction of Ezra Pound's cantos. Big aesthetic contrast there. Yeats's introduction to his 1936 anthology, The Oxford Book of Modern Verse, highlights the importance of folk song to the advent of modern poetry. You will know that Thomas edited an anthology of poems and songs for the open air. The importance of folk song to Yeats and Thomas is one of the undernoted aesthetic links between them. Like Yeats, Thomas thought that folk song could help to revitalise poetry. Cecil Sharp's groundbreaking book, English Folk Songs, in 1907, led him to believe that folk song might do for poetry what it was starting to do for English music. Sharp gave Thomas traditional melodies for his poems and songs anthology. Earlier, Thomas had written the Yeats poem appears again, and there's a quotation from Thomas's prose beneath it. Thomas wrote, "Of all music, the old ballads and folk songs and their airs are richest in the plain, immortal symbols. The best of them seem to be written in a language that should be universal. Only simplicity were truly simple to mankind." Two of Thomas's earliest poems involve folk songs and the same title, An Old Song. And the first of them is there, and I'll come to these poems in a moment. But first, how do we distinguish poems from songs, or should we do so? Whatever the ancient links between lyric poetry and music, a lyric poem now means something different from the lyric of a song. And Thomas's point about the complexity of simplicity may apply to all songs. Some of the best poets, when they try to write songs, seem to have the most difficulty in stripping their diction and rhythm down to the basics of plain, immortal symbols. Shakespeare, now apparently working with Radiohead, have you heard? Could manage it. Hey ho, the wind and the rain. What could be simpler or more profound? Conversely, Leonard Cohen is less good on page. Again, when existing poems are set to music, there's often insufficient, including the settings of Thomas's song, by the way, there's often insufficient space between the words for the music. Wilfred Owen's, I think that's true of Britain's War Requiem, incidentally. Owen's highly concentrated poems leave little room for musical manoeuvre, so the music and poetry don't quite meld. So perhaps then we should regard metre, rhythm, rhyme and assonance, poetry's repertoire of sound effects, as regarded as verbal music, wholly distinct from music, even if some poets can make them harmonise. A term akin to verbal music is the singing line, a term which defines poetry as its own kind of song. The singing line might mean a line in which words and rhythm attain a special, memorable intensity, like the conclusion of Thomas's Old Man. Only an avenue, dark, nameless, without end. However, the singing line can also stand for poetry in general. Any line we recognise as poetry must have intensifying qualities to some degree. To be poetry rather than prose, it must serve a poem's overall verbal music. And Thomas himself crucially marked the point where words start to sing, when he turned the subject matter of Old Man from prose into poetry. The prose version had ended, only a dark avenue was at an end. Not a singing line, not poetry. only an avenue, dark ends without end. Yet there are theorists and practitioners of poetry who have a rather puritanical objection to the pleasures of verbal music, and hence to song as an overarching term. They don't accept the poet's job as articulating sweet sounds together, to quote Yeats in Ready by Yeats, Adam's Curse. Articulating sweet sounds together, that's how he defines being a poet. And nor would Puritans, poetic Puritans, approve Thomas's related wish in his poem for his son to create a song as sweet as a blackbird's and as long. In fact, I think that contemporary issues about verbal music go back to that clash between Yeats and Pound. He who sings a lasting song thinks in a marrow bone. So now, before considering some thrush poems, I want to look briefly at what Thomas takes from folk song, from the folk bones of poetry. Thomas wrote his 2 ode songs in December 1914, his first month of poetry. Indeed, these song poems may celebrate the poems he'd already written. Thomas's discovery of his poetic vocation. They are at once old songs and about old songs, about poetry's roots in their sounds and rhythm. In Old Song 1 and Old Song 1, Thomas adapts the Lincolnshire poacher to his own autobiography, with a nature-loving child and overburdened adult writer. I've served one master, ill and well, much more than 7 years. The poacher's illicit nightlife is identified with Thomas's escape from personal and literary constraints. That escape, the advent of poetry, of this very poem, is ultimately symbolized by the song being sung. The poem ends, and with this melody on my lips, and no one by to care, indoors or out on shiny nights, or dark in open air, I am for a moment made a man that sings out of his heart. Oh, 'tis my delight of a shiny night in the season of the year. Thomas's old song poems are complementary in how they render his poetic epiphany. The Lincolnshire poacher poem allies his poetry with tradition, shows it emerging from tradition. The song is instrumental in the speaker being made a man that sings out of his heart. And the second old song, and Old Song 2, then focuses not on tradition, but on the man that sings out of his heart, on individual vision. The speaker says of a light across the sea, no one else in the whole world saw that same sight. And that's rather like no one else hearing the unknown bird. Speaker then finds himself singing the bawdy sea shanty, Amsterdam. And all I did was to repeat, I'll go no more a-roving with you, fair maid. This song eventually takes over the poem. I'm not sure of the, eventually takes over the poem, perhaps gives it back to tradition. There's a bit in italics, the last verse in italics shows the poem, the song actually taking over. An old song is based throughout on the verse pattern and idiom of the Lincolnshire poacher. An old song too is split between Thomas's new poetic voice and the Amsterdam song. But here the poet-speaker isn't the only singer around, as you can see. Birds are singing too. A robin sang, a shade in shade. And all I did was to repeat, I'll go no more a-roving with you, fair maid. The sailor's song of merry loving, with dusk and seagulls mewing mixed sweet. A robin sang, seagulls mewing. These lines link bird song with human song in an acoustic mix that prefigures messiaen. And they also imply that old songs are strangely in tune with the natural environment. This is again implied by two other early poems, which you may know, poems that interweave folk music, outdoor night settings, and a sense of poetic mystery. Poems called The Penny Whistle and The Gypsy. 2 years later, Thomas brought another old song into his poetry, Rio Grande, a shanty like Amsterdam. From this song, he took elements for Early One Morning, a stark poem about his departure for war. I'm not sure if we have that. Okay. Early One Morning, a ballad-like poem, which blends phrases from Rio Grande into a foreboding refrain. I'm bound away forever, away somewhere, away forever. Now, only a few folk songs directly enter Thomas's poetry. Another one is the Welsh Song of the Ash Grove. But folk song structures, as his two old songs suggest, may have gone underground to resurface as form, diction, rhythm, refrain, and other repetition devices. Jonathan Barker argued convincingly, for instance, that over a third of Thomas's poems show the influence of the ballad tradition, that is, on his extremely various versions of the quatrain. I'm now going to read a quatrain poem by Thomas, The Thrush. And Thrush is one of the three thrush poems I mentioned, poems that will finally bring me back to birdsong and poetry. The Thrush. When winter's ahead, what can you read in November that you read in April when winter's dead? I hear the thrush, and I see him alone at the end of the lane, near the bare poplar's tip, singing continuously. Is it more that you know than that, even as in April? So in November, winter is gone, but must go. Or is all your law not to call November, November, and April, April, and winter, winter, no more? But I know the months all, and their sweet names, April, May, and June, and October. As you call and call, I must remember what dies in April, and consider what will be born of a fair November. And April I love for what it was born of, and November for what it will die in, what they are and what they are not, while you love what is kind, what you can sing in, and love and forget in all that's ahead and behind. Thomas's quatrain poems vary in rhyme scheme, in line length, both within and between poems, and in how individual stanzas relate to an overall dynamic. The thrush quatrain is rhymed A-B-C-A, and this scheme adds emphasis to syntactical self-containment of the first four quatrains. But halfway through, the poem opens out to make the last four quatrains a single sentence. Another variation is that line lengths range from 4 to 9 syllables, from 2 to 4 stresses. So what might this formerly complex poem go to folk song or ballad, or perhaps birdsong? For one thing, the diction is generally simple and monosyllabic. It also involves much repetition, as with the key monosyllabic verbs, read, know, call, die, love. Further repetition, the month's sweet names, also has a refrain-like impact. perhaps these folk echoes fit with how the poem hears a thrush's song. There is stress on its repetitive persistence, singing continuously as you call and call. That persistence may be at once mirrored and countered by the richer orchestration of a poem, which explicitly compares birdsong and poetry. In fact, one source for the poem is Thomas's reaction to a poem by Keats. Keats claimed to have translated a thrush's song and makes the thrush say, "Oh, fret not after knowledge, I am none." Thomas comments in his book on Keats, the great odes, the poem to Autumn and the Eve of St. Agnes could never have been translated out of a thrush's song. And in fact, his own thrush poem also seems to involve a reaction to Ode to a Nightingale. As contrasted with Keats's ode, the thrush does not wish away the weariness, the fever, and the fret. This poem may value the greater, if oppressive, scope of human consciousness. That means of questions, seemingly beyond the bird's syntax of call and call. The poem lays out cognitive differences between what bird and poet might read or know or remember. You love what is kind, what you can sing in, and love and forget in, all that's ahead and behind. Yet, next poem, an earlier thrush poem, The Word, appears to move in the opposite direction. In the thrush, the bird forgets, the poet remembers. But the word begins with the speaker relaxed about forgetting. So many things I have forgot, that once were much to me, or that were not. As an Ars Poetica poem, The Word revisits Thomas's fine critical aphorism in his book on Morris Maeterlinck. Anything, however small, may make a poem. Nothing, however great, is certain to. Anything, however small, may make a poem. Nothing, however great, is certain to. To forget the supposedly great things that Thomas goes on to name in the Word is to question the poet's duty to register momentous events. He goes on, I have forgot two names of the mighty men. Yeah, I have forgot two names of the mighty men that fought and lost or won in the old wars, of kings and fiends and gods and most of the stars. This amnesia on the speaker's part doesn't imply that poetry should ignore the current war, which Thomas is about to enlist. This is a poem from July 1915. He was indeed critical of most war poems published so far. Yet, as you will know, his poetry never forgets the war. Rather, he engages with it in his own way. What the speaker has forgotten and not forgotten amounts to a declaration of artistic independence, or a declaration in favour of art. That he has not forgotten a name that never can die, because spring after spring, some thrushes learn to say it as they sing. This is another poem that invokes poetry's mysterious sources by means of a bird. And in the Word, we may be witnessing the creation of a poem. That is the point where the speaker says, or perhaps I'm thinking of the elder scent that is like food, or why I am content with the wild rose scent that is like memory. Here, conscious states of thinking or memory are mediated by the senses and thereby become unconscious. This is a condition of creative receptivity or readiness, which resembles Keats's negative capability, I think. And it's then that thrushes re-enter the scene. this name suddenly is cried out to me from somewhere in the bushes by a bird, over and over again, a pure thrush word. In effect, a poem has been created, cried out, and if the unknown bird signifies poetic inspiration, the pure thrush word may signify poetic achievement. That includes the poem now completed, the word, with its happy rhyme of bird and word. Yet the unknown bird and the thrush are similar in their stress on poetry as symbolic, as not delivering a message about great things. Bodiless sweet in the unknown bird, a thingless name, but not less adjunct to the word, a thingless name in the word. And by implication too, poetry represents lasting memory, not all that forgotten stuff. A pure thrush word emphasizes poetry as sound. In calling the thrush's song pure, thingness, Thomas allies it with certain ideas about poetry. Here he may invoke Paul Verlaine's art poétique, la musique avant toute chose. Music or verbal music first. Thomas also anticipates Paul Valéry's later concept, la poésie pure. Close to home, he might be recalling his youthful discipleship to Walter Pater, who had said that all art aspires to condition music. Birdsong, of course, is the perfect symbol for poetry as sound. In fact, the word doesn't wholly erase meaning from music or from birdsong. A thrush word is a word, and what some thrushes learn involves saying as well as singing. Earlier I quoted a scientific reference to birds' auditory vocal learning. This seems to be what the thrush is doing in this poem, and the poem too. But singing verbal music again comes first, or is a sine qua non. A thrush has a less prominent role in the last poem I want to discuss, The Green Roads. Do you have it? I love this poem increasingly. It's my absolute favourite Thomas poems. The thrush role, as I said, is less prominent, yet here again, birdsong seems a crucial context and touchstone for poetry. This thrush helps to focus what it means to be a poet, a large question which I think The Green Roads obliquely raises. The Green Roads belong to a series of valedictory poems that look back over Thomas's journey to war, together with his earthly journey and poetic journey. Both poet and thrush are placed at the border of the engulfing forest that will reappear in Lights Out. The green roads that end in the forest are strewn with white goose feathers this June, like marks left behind by someone gone to the forest to show his track, but he has never come back. Down each green road a cottage looks at the forest. Round one the nettled towers, two are bathed in flowers. An old man along the green road to the forest strays from one, from another a child alone. In the thicket bordering the forest, all day long, a thrush triddles his song. As you can see or hear, The Green Roads is another poem inflected by folk song. It presents archetypal vistas, plain and mortal symbols perhaps, forest and cottages, old man and child. The poem also involves emphatic rhyme and refrain, yet both are unusual and unsettling in their effect. The refrain word forest ends the first line of each couplet, this ominous insistence. The second line has a wandering internal rhyme, strewn, dune, track, back, long song, long song, long song is repeated twice as a rhyme and becomes a refrain. Here, as elsewhere, Thomas intertwines the war, perhaps, with his egocentric thinking about the earth, about human presence and absence, the man who has never come back. Like the mill water, forest represents the opposite of home. Forest haunts and encroaches on human dwelling. It unsettles the human psyche. The cottagers look at the forest as if wary of it. The forest symbolism of the green roads again raises questions of memory and forgetting, perhaps in an ultimate sense. The forest encompasses historical oblivion, cultural memory loss, total silence even. That oak saw the ages pass in the forest. They were a host, but their memories are lost. In going to war, Thomas too faces into oblivion, and, replied, he may see himself in the hypothetical person who has never come back. And perhaps The Green Rose isn't a wholly negative poem, but a poem that sets out polarities of earthly dwelling. Thomas's last thrush poem, or bird poem, may define him as an eco-poet. And it may also define such a poet's responsibilities. Like the thrush's song, perhaps emulating the thrush's song, the poem's metrical twiddles derive from and speak to the earthly condition. And poetry, once again, has a crucial memorial role and status. It resists oblivion. Only the poet does not forget the forest. That is, the precarious terms in which we are inhabitants of earth. And not forgetting the forest seems to depend partly on poetry listening to the thrush. All things forget the forest, excepting perhaps me, when now I see the old man, the child, the goose feathers at the edge of the forest, and hear all day long the thrush repeat his song.